Nigel Farage.
Thank you, Donald, and good evening, everybody. Well, the Metropolitan Police today making an announcement that they know of two men who arrived at Gatwick Airport from Moscow on the 2nd of March and stayed at the City Stay Hotel in Bow Road, East London. They then have their movements tracked to Salisbury, where Sergei Skripal's front door was contaminated with Novichok using a modified perfume bottle. Now, they've named the two men as Alexander Petrov and Ruslan Boshirov, but they say these names are aliases. In response to this, Theresa May, in Prime Minister's Questions, had this to say today.
The government has concluded that the two individuals named by the police and CPS are officers from the Russian Military Intelligence Service, also known as the GRU. The actions of the GRU are a threat to all our allies and to all our citizens. And on the basis of what we have learnt in the Salisbury investigation and what we know about this organisation more broadly, we must now step up our collective efforts specifically against the GRU.
And of course, remember, it wasn't just the Skripals, of course, who were poisoned, because remember that Dawn Sturgis and her partner Charlie Rowley found this perfume bottle, and of course, subsequently, Miss Sturgis died. Well, in response to what the police say is absolutely conclusive proof that they know who these individuals are, this is what the leader of the opposition, Jeremy Corbyn, had to say.
Our response as a country must be guided by the rule of law, support for international agreements and respect for human rights, even and perhaps especially when other countries don't respect those agreements.
He didn't sound that convinced, did he? And Boris Johnson was withering in his response to Jeremy Corbyn.
I think the whole House will have noted what I'm afraid was the somewhat weaselly language of the Leader of the Opposition in failing to condemn what is now, I think, incontrovertible in the eyes of all right-thinking people, the involvement of the Russian state at the highest level in the Salisbury poisonings. And will my right honourable friend confirm that we will be asking that these two individuals are produced for justice by Russia, and will she be joining and stepping up our diplomatic activity, our countermeasures, our targeted sanctions, so that the whole community, international community, can show their repugnance at what Russia has done in a way that I'm afraid the right honourable gentleman, the Leader of the Opposition, has signally failed to do today.
So what, given this new information, should the government do next? And if you think we need more sanctions and more pressure on Russia, then call me on 0345 6060 973. Or maybe you think, actually, there isn't really much more we can do, is there? In which case, text to 84850. And I wonder, what hope is there of us getting back to any sort of normal relations with Russia anytime too? Let me know your views by tweeting, using the hashtag Farage and LBC at LBC. And of course, as ever, you can watch us on Facebook and comment there too. I'm live from Brisbane this morning. Well, the government have made some announcements in terms of what they do intend to do. To begin, they've summoned a Russian diplomat in London to explain their deep displeasure. Secondly, they have issued a European arrest warrant. Now, it's believed these men flew back to Moscow, but the European arrest warrant is so that if they turn up in any European country, although I'm not terribly sure what use that will be if we believe the names we were given are aliases anyway. Perhaps more significantly, we've requested an urgent meeting of the UN Security Council, and British Ambassador Karen Pierce hopes this meeting will take place in New York tomorrow. And of course, there's the political response, which you heard from Boris. So there's a series of measures that the government have taken today. I have to say, I'm not actually sure what more they can do. After all, we've already been expelling diplomats, and even Donald Trump expelled 60 Russian diplomats. You know, what more can we do? You tell me. I'm not sure there is much more that we can do. Let's see what you think. David is calling from Sheffield, and he's a new caller to this show. Good evening, David.
Good evening, Nigel. Lovely to speak to you.
Good to speak to you.
Just touching what you said, very little we can do. one thing I think they ought to do is really just release all this publicity they have. If they've got photographic evidence, they've got video footage, show it on the TV. Let's have a look and expose it to the Russians and just say, what's your argument against this? The problem is, my opinion is a lot of within the Russian government, it's almost like a mafia-based thing. Maybe he hasn't got control of the whole Russian hierarchy. A lot of it may be just mafia-led and money-led. You just never know.
Well, no, that's... I mean, David, I remember going back to March, many callers, ringing into LBC and saying, look, maybe this wasn't on the orders of Putin. This guy, Skripal, would have been seen as a traitor by those working for the Russian authorities. Maybe this was a sort of private hit job. It's possible, although unlikely. Let me just tell you, David, what the official response from the Kremlin is. An aide there has said that it's hard to understand what Britain is trying to signal to Russia by naming these suspects. Yuri Ushanov, I'm not very good at Russian pronunciation, told reporters, we have heard or seen two names. These names mean nothing to me personally, especially since Scotland Yard said that they were aliases. I don't understand why this was done and what sort of signal the Brits are sending. It's difficult to understand. So there's certainly no admission of culpability coming from Russia.
Well, there isn't, no, but as you said, they may have just been hitman, hired and so-called. Now, the worrying thing is about it, if I heard the news right today, that when they got rid of this Novichok in a perfume bottle, they put it in a charity bin to dispose of it. Now, if that's the case, I mean, I suppose it is. It's an awful thing that's happened to that young lady. But if someone would have found that and sprayed it in a public place, we could have been looking at hundreds of people being killed. Oh,
absolutely. I mean, look, David, I do get your basic point that you want to see more information. You want to see some footage, some evidence. They do say they found traces of Novichok in that hotel room in East London. I think when the Metropolitan Police tell us they've got this evidence, they've got this trail of people coming into Gatwick, going back to Moscow, I think actually that puts beyond doubt that two Russian operatives did this. Who they were directly working for may be a separate question. David, I thank you for your call. Let's go to Linda in Hull. Linda, good evening.
Hi, Nigel.
Hello.
The problem that bothers me is that the superintendent or policeman said the names that these two Russians used were aliases. And we don't know the names. And there's a phone number where we can ring up if anybody knows them. Yes. And then in the next breath, Theresa May says, we know who they are, they belong to Russian military intelligence, and we're going to go for them there. But how can they go for them and know who they are if they don't know who they are? You know what I mean?
Well, no, I do get your point, Linda. We don't know exactly who they are. We believe they're aliases. OK, scepticism from Hull there, from Linda. John from Thornbury, who's a regular caller to our show. John, what do you make of it all?
Yes, well, I think we're going to be whistling in the wind on this one as regards getting them before a court of law.
Yes.
President Rasputin is not going to cooperate on that. I think that's fairly obvious. I think the only response is that in concert with our allies, we've got to up the sanctions.
To what point, John? I mean, where do we take the sanctions to next, in your view?
Well, I've no specific proposals to put forward, but we've got to show some sort of response, because what has happened is an absolute outrage, and with this new evidence, I think even the Corbynistas are going to be struggling to suggest that it wasn't anything else but Russian involvement. I
mean, Corbyn at the time, kept saying, give us the evidence, give us the evidence. Even today, when the Metropolitan Police told us they've got the evidence, though I take the point, maybe we should see a bit more of it. Corbyn again today sounding very sceptical on this. Does that politically, do you think, put him in a difficult spot?
Oh, yes, I think it's another nail in the coffin with the Rotherham scandal and his response to that, with the anti-Semitism row. And all the little things, like not singing the national anthem, etc.
I know. I was there. John, I was there. It was the 75th anniversary of Battle of Britain Day. I was sitting in the row behind him, and he didn't sing the national anthem. I thought, that's not good with patriotic Labour voters. John, I thank you, and John wants more sanctions. What more can the government do? Tony says, hi, Nigel, if the names are fake, how do we know they are GRU? Well, it's a fair point, but when the Metropolitan Police tell us that they've got evidence of these guys coming into Gatwick Airport, going to a hotel in London, staying there, traces of Novichok being found in the room, knowing that it was the fake perfume bottle that contaminated the Skripal's front door, and then led on, ultimately, sadly, to the death of Dawn Sturgis. You know, I do believe all of that. That is not confected in any way at all. The GRU would not fly direct from Moscow on Russian passports. That would be idiocy. Okay, a lot of you asking more questions. Who actually were these guys? Ian in Morecambe is my next caller. Ian, what more can the UK government do?
Oh, I'm not so sure whether they can, but it was an interesting... Well, I'll answer that secondarily if I can and quickly for you.
Yes, right.
My thoughts are that the guy who rang previously, who's thinking that it might have been a mafia-led organisation thing, I can't actually see that, because I can't think of anybody who would do an international crime without Putin knowing about it. Taking that aside, I do believe he does give the nod and the wink, probably pushes it out sideways and downwards, so that he keeps himself clear, so he can virtually vindicate himself and almost sleep straight in his bed at night, ha-ha. But that's probably how it is, and I reckon he does give the nod to these things. And as regards us, I think it's ridiculous. We're just a paper tiger. Where's Litvinenko's people? Are they in jail yet?
No, and of course there have been other high-profile Russian billionaires that have died in very, very strange circumstances. One thinks of Boris Berezovsky. Ian, what does the government do, though? I mean, they're saying today they are convinced that it is the GRU, although it is a slight weak point given that these names are aliases. But what more can she do, Ian?
Can she actually get those people to trial? And can she actually get a result from it? And will that actually happen? And what kind of international disturbance will it create between, and the tensions between us already? You can't really imagine us going too hard.
You know, the chances of us getting these guys extradited to the UK for trial are just about zip. Equally, the chances of their European arrest warrant yielding any fruit, I would think, are hovering at around about zero. Yeah, difficult to know what more the government can do. They have got this UN Security Council meeting taking place in New York tomorrow. But yeah, it's actually quite difficult for the government to know what to do now. Thanks very much, Ian. You're listening to the Nigel Farage Show, exclusively on LBC. It is now 6:15. Well, the Metropolitan Police are absolutely certain they know the two individuals that came into the country, where they stayed in London and what they did. What they don't actually know is what their names are, because they believe they were acting under aliases. The Prime Minister is taking some action. She's called Russian diplomats to come and meet her in London. She's trying to get tomorrow a meeting of the UN Security Council. Beyond that, it's quite tough to know exactly what she can do. I'm asking for your ideas. But before I get back to that, the Brexit debate is never too far away, and today's intervention comes from the former Bank of England Governor, Lord Mervyn King. This is what he had to say earlier on this morning.
If as a country we cannot take a big decision about whether or not we should be in the European Union, which is based on sovereignty, it's based on controlling our borders, there are arguments on both sides, we ought to be able to have a reasonable and civilised debate on that, and then have a vote. What we're now getting is not a reasonable or civilised discussion. It's a discussion where both sides seem to be throwing insults at each other, and I find that deeply depressing.
Well, Mervyn King, unimpressed by Theresa May's government, calling them incompetent, and saying that our strategy should be, look, we'd like a free trade deal, and we think you probably would like one too. But if we can't agree, don't be under any misapprehension. We have put in place the measures that would enable us to leave without one. I agree with that 100%. And you know something? His predecessor, I think, would have taken exactly the same view. Eddie also, a great believer that joining the Euro at that time would have been a mistake. But what of our current Governor of the Bank of England, Mark Carney? Well, he, of course, today has been saying that a no-deal Brexit would lead to a slump in the pound on the international exchanges. He never, ever stops, this man, with a constant diet of negativity, a Remainer to his fingertips. He is due to end his term of office next year. And yet Theresa May seems to think he ought to stay on until 2020. Why on earth would the Prime Minister want to keep on a governor of the Bank of England who is so negative about Brexit. And any thoughts on that, please text me on 84850. So, what is the government to do? What are our next steps with Russia? Your texts and tweets. This weapon in Salisbury stands alongside a dirty bomb. The Novichok nerve agent is designed to kill thousands. That arrogant little man Putin needs to be brought to book. He's the one that dishes out the orders, says Frank in Egremont. At what point do we issue an international arrest warrant for President Putin and expect our international allies to turn him in if he makes a foreign visit, says Stuart in Romford? Well, fingers they're pointing towards Putin. Rajdev is calling from Twickenham and a new caller to this show. Good evening.
Good evening, Nigel. I think that this is all a bit of a waste of time. It makes, obviously, sexy news stories, but in reality, this is international espionage. We can't expect our resource police to actually get justice for those victims in this country. The only thing that we can do is to be much firmer on Russia. They're obviously making a statement. They're making a statement to everybody, every disaffected in the world, to say we can get to you no matter where you go.
You can run, but you can't hide, is what the Russians are saying, isn't it? And of course, it's worth reminding people that this guy had worked for the Russian security services and had then defected to us. So he was seen, wasn't he, Rajdev? He was seen as a traitor by Putin and many in Russia.
And we obviously, in inviting him here, we took that risk on, and the same with other Russians that have come here. We have taken them on with the understanding that Putin would go after them, and I'm sure we knew that. The only thing we could do at this point, we're spending a lot of money on this investigation, which is not going to lead anywhere apart from what we already know. The only thing that can be done is we say to Russia, we're no longer going to issue you visas to come to this country.
Yeah, we could do that.
That's all we can do.
Yeah, we could do that. But one curiosity to me. I mean, if Putin wanted this guy Skripal bumped off, right? Why go through a procedure with Novichok in a perfume bottle that could have killed hundreds or thousands of innocent people? Very strange way of going about it, isn't it?
Well, the problem is, he's trying to pick a method of killing. It's all international espionage, isn't it? He's picking a way of killing somebody that sort of allows plausible deniability rather than just shooting somebody in the street and then getting caught.
We could argue, couldn't we, that if spies go around killing each other, well, it's not very nice, but it's not the end of the world. But let's spare a thought, all of us, please, for Dawn Sturgis, 44 years old, an innocent person who died of this Novichok agent. That's the bit, Rajdev, that gets me. Listen, thank you for your call. And the idea there that we stop issuing visas to Russians, that would make the Russian business community sit up and put some real pressure, perhaps, on President Putin. Ian is calling from High Wycombe, another new caller to this show. Ian, good evening.
Good evening, Nigel.
So what do you think what can Mrs. May do, Ian? Come on.
Right. Okay. This will give you the two Russians' heads on a plate by Friday. This Friday. What you
right.
do,
okay. I am waiting. So you've got the solution, right. Ian. Yeah.
Yeah. Freeze all the assets, bank accounts, and properties of all the Russian oligarchs living in this country, who basically prop up the Russian regime. That would basically, instantaneously, they will give you those two guys' heads on a plate by Friday.
Would that mean that Chelsea would that mean that Chelsea Football Club might not be able to play this weekend?
Yeah, why not? Why not? Indeed, why not? Why not? Yeah, there's absolutely. Right. I say there's no reason why not. I think you've got to remember that you've got to hit this guy in the pocket. You're not going to hit him anywhere else. You've got to hit him in the pocket. And the best way to actually get tough on these murders on our soil is to get tough by basically shutting down or taking all the Russian money and from the Russian oligarchs that live in these huge, great mansions in London, and just basically seize everything. That's what I would do if I was Prime Minister.
Ian, wouldn't you, by doing that, wouldn't you punish a lot of innocent people, a lot of innocent Russians going about their business? Wouldn't you enrage millions of Chelsea supporters? Isn't this a bit over the top?
I think there's one chap whose girlfriend is a very innocent bystander, and that's a poor lady that was killed during that attack. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Now, now I think this is the time, if you're going to do anything, for a country to bring down a Malaysian airline and us to stand back and watch. To me, it's beyond belief.
Ian, you have offered the most radical solution that any caller tonight will offer, and I take it, and I'll be fascinated to see how others respond. Ian from High Wycombe, thank you very much indeed. John asks me by text, anyone that comes into contact with this stuff, meaning Novichok, seems to suffer. How come these guys didn't? John, I'm not a chemist. I can't answer that. I'm sorry. If we don't know their real name, how can we know they are even Russian, says Rob. Well, Rob, if we believe the Metropolitan Police, and I suggest we do, we know the aeroplane they came in on. We know the hotel they stayed at. We know they went to Salisbury. I agree there are still some questions, but I think it's pretty much beyond doubt these guys did it. I don't doubt Russia was involved in the poisoning, but do you not think we'd get a better response if we asked Russia for their input instead of instantly pointing the finger? Of course, if you go on blaming Russia, they will go on the defensive. Maybe speak to them and get their input instead of talking to them like they're criminals. I get by text. One of the suggestions was the Russians said, oh, why don't we help you with your investigation? But just think about that for a moment. Wouldn't that give the Russian security services full access to our own intelligence agencies and how we operate? It's not something, I'm sorry, we could ever contemplate doing. Let's go to Kensington and speak to Joshua. Good evening, Joshua.
Good evening. How are you?
Oh, I'm very well. I've just sort of almost gobsmacked by Ian in High Wycombe, saying a total freeze on all bank accounts and all Russian assets, including Chelsea Football Club. And I can't see that ever being on the agenda. What do you think the government should do, Joshua?
You know what? I haven't been listening to all of your show, but right. I was going to suggest something very similar to what that gentleman said. I haven't heard anything of what he said. But you know what? Right. It sounds very close to what I'm going to say next. Now, yeah, go on. I think the thing is, we know that Alexander Litvinenko, who was poisoned with a uranium or a radioactive substance.
Oh, polonium it was called, wasn't it?
Yeah, polonium. Sorry, yeah. They managed to trace it all the way to the Arsenal football game, where one of the assassins was sitting down to watch the Russian team play Arsenal. They then traced it back to the airport, and they've done everything. Yeah. Even if you think this wasn't a case where the Russians had a dubious motive to do it, you did have that one, and then you had another one, and then you had another one before that. Now, unless you go after the money, and I can tell you now that Vladimir Putin is one of the biggest investors in this country into property. And unless you go after the people that he's...
Vladimir... Are you saying Vladimir Putin himself is a massive investor in this country?
Through different... different people.
That may or may not be right. But Joshua, so your basic point is similar to Ian's point before. Freeze Russian assets, smoke them out, and get these two guys sent here for trial.
Chelsea, when you were saying about Chelsea Football Club, right? Why do you think Abramovich didn't get through to this country? Why do you think he had to go to Israel to...
Joshua, that's going a bit deep, and we're not discussing him as an individual, but it would upset a lot of Chelsea fans. Joshua, thank you. Well, suggestions coming in. Go for the money. That's the only way to hurt them. That's what LBC listeners are saying. You're listening to the Nigel Farage Show, exclusive on LBC, and it's now 6:30 and time for the news with Lisa Aziz. Well, the Metropolitan Police and Theresa May are certain who the men were that committed the Novichok atrocity down in Salisbury, though they're not actually exactly sure of what their names are. And before I get back to asking you what should be done, and thus far, we've had people saying, freeze all Russian assets in the UK, stop business with Russia, but that would have huge knock-on consequences, not just for Chelsea football fans, but, as Steve from Sussex says to me, you try and shut Russia down from the UK end, and they will cut oil and gas from their end. Not just to us, but to other countries too. And Steve, here's the point. A point Donald Trump made on his recent tour to Europe. 60% of German power comes from Russian gas, which of course is why Mrs. Merkel only expelled 3 Russian diplomats after the Salisbury poisoning, whereas Donald Trump expelled 60. Shutting down Russian business, freezing accounts, perhaps could lead to them hurting us and the West much more than we could hurt them. Before I get back to that, Andy Burnham, of course, senior Labour politician and now the Greater Manchester Mayor, has been saying some interesting things on Brexit today.
I think it would cause real damage, real division on the streets of Greater Manchester. However, there is something worse than a people's vote, and that is crashing out of the European Union without a deal. So in the circumstances where that is the only thing we're facing, I would actually support a people's vote to stop a no-deal Brexit.
So there's Andy Burnham saying, if you stop people getting the Brexit they voted for, there'll be riots on the streets. But it's preferable to have riots on the streets than a no-deal Brexit, and that he will now support, if it comes to that, a suspension of Article 50. And remember, folks, I've been predicting here for months the great political battle this autumn will be the attempt by many in the House of Commons to stop us leaving on March the 29th next year, and ultimately he would support a second referendum. And that comes on the same day when twice Prime Minister May asked Jeremy Corbyn in the House of Commons to stand up and rule out a second referendum, and he ignored her challenge. The Labour Party, folks, are lining themselves up. We will see them at their conference starting on the 23rd of September. The Labour Party are getting ready to betray Brexit and to betray 5 million of their own voters. And we always talk about Brexit as if somehow this is a huge civil war that is going on within the Conservative Party. Well, I tell you what, it's going to be a very big conflict between Labour and many of their voters out there in the country. And responding to an earlier question I made, Tex says, it's clear Mrs May wants to keep hold of Carney because he's a Remainer, not despite it, says Steve. Steve, I have to say, every time this woman stands up and says that there's going to be a clean Brexit, we're going to take back control of our laws, our borders, our money, I don't believe her, and I simply don't trust her. What should Mrs May do about the Novichok poisoning case? What can she do? Freezing the money has been suggested, but I am responding back by saying that could have pretty devastating consequences, particularly for the German economy. Stuart is calling from Colchester and is a new caller to this show. Welcome, Stuart.
Well, good evening, Nigel.
Good evening.
Hello.
So what can be done, Stuart?
Well, unfortunately, as much as I disagree, I think we have to admit the fact that there's not a lot can be done. One, to reiterate what you've already recently said, the economy will be severely affected. So I don't believe... I mean, what you have to remember is MPs like Theresa May, political parties, they're temporary employees. They're not there for the long run. So they're not going to do anything that will damage their stay whilst they're in power. And second of all, freezing assets of Russian oligarchs and businesses in the UK will have no effect. Because if this guy, if Putin really is the type of chap that can organise and orchestrate murder, then nobody, none of these oligarchs and these business people are going to say anything against him anyway, for fear of repercussion. They'll put up with the aggro. They're not going to go against him because they'll be too scared. So
there is certainly a sort of certainly a rule of fear there, isn't there? So really, Stuart, Mrs May's a bit snookered, isn't she, on this?
I believe she is. I believe.
Do you know what?
It's unfortunate.
Do you know what?
I disagree with it, but I believe she is, and we have to face the facts. It's happened. We're in. If it was a game of chess, we're in checkmate, and we have to now deal with. Let's go back to dealing with Brexit. That's now a problem, or that's always been a problem. But we're wasting a lot of time on something with no positive outcome, I believe.
Stuart, I have to say, I take your position. I really don't believe there is much more that we can do. Thank you very much indeed for your call. A second referendum is inevitable. I'm getting through responding to what was said there by Andy Burnham. Well, I don't believe it is inevitable. I also believe if we are forced to vote again on this, do not underestimate the anger of the British people. You'll be really surprised by how big the Leave vote is. That's certainly what I believe. If they want another vote, there should only be two options: accept the deal or no deal, says Babs in Cheshire. Well, I think those who want to have a second referendum would actually like to have the option that we stay fully part of the Union. More of that over the next few weeks. We're trying to deal with Russia right now. May is wasting her time. Russia doesn't care. Nothing can be done. On Twitter, if you put sanctions on the bank accounts of the wealthiest Russians in the UK, all they will do is take their money somewhere else, stop buying UK goods, and put lots of people out of work, cutting off our nose to spite our face. Stuart, I think a lot of people probably would agree with that. Michael is calling from Romford. Hi, Michael. Good evening.
Good evening, Nigel. It's a pleasure to speak to you. I'll be waiting a long time for this.
Well, I'm delighted that you are on the line. Michael, yes. What do you think? I mean, you know, we've called for a UN Security Council meeting. We've seen the political response of Boris, against Jeremy Corbyn in the House of Commons. We've summoned diplomats to come and see us and get a dressing down. But what more can we do?
Well, in response to the EU, I think I'm 100% behind you.
Yeah.
But in response to this problem with Russia, I think we should send them a very strong message. Yeah, that they've named 2 operatives of the GRU who are 2 Russian soldiers who are operating in our country, and they obviously know their real names. So I think that they might...
Well, Michael, do they? You know, the Metropolitan Police announced their names, Alexander Petrov, Rusyan Borisov, and then, so they name them and then say, but these are aliases. So do we really know who they are?
Yeah, that's why they said they've got aliases. They know who they are.
Okay, all right.
They wouldn't name them as GRU unless they know who they are, unless they know who they work for.
All right, well, let's assume you're right, Michael. Let's assume you're right about that. What do we do? What can she do next?
She needs to reach out and snatch the life out of them.
And how would she do that?
Well, she sanctions MI6 to go and do it.
All right, fine. A hit job is what Michael in Romford suggests. I can't approve of that, folks. If we believe that Putin has authorised people to be killed on British streets and in British cities, the last thing we should do is lower ourselves to that level and do the same in return. I think that would be truly awful. Edwina on Facebook says, what clever government made the decision to sell our gas and oil supply lines to Russia? Madness. Well, the whole of the German economy, Edwina, the whole of it is dependent on Russian gas. And of course, a former German Chancellor, Gerhard Schroeder, has been a director of Gazprom. You couldn't make some of this stuff up, could you? I'm going to go to James in Clapham. James, good evening to you.
Good evening, Nigel.
So what should be done? What can be done?
What can be done, Nigel? I disagree with what you're saying, is we can't put sanctions in. Sanctions are there to impose, financial hardship, not just for the recipient that gets the sanctions, but the actual person putting the sanctions on. Now, we need to...
Okay, but what ones would work, James?
We need to freeze their assets, all their assets, and start putting in a trade embargo with technology that Russia cannot go and invest in their gas and their oil, because they have technology that basically is from the 90s. We need to stop off and starve off their technology. That's the only way the Russians will learn.
Okay, and so you're perfectly prepared, James, for lots of innocent Russian people to have their assets frozen in order to put this pressure on the Russian government?
Well, we did exactly the same to the Iraqis, and the Americans are doing it to the Iranians. If it works, it works.
Okay. And how long do you think it would take for this to work?
Well, the last trade embargoes that we did against the Russians, which, of course, you quite rightly said the Germans were not participating in because they don't want to basically have their wealth affected. It would take about 16 months for it to start hitting them, but what do we do? Do we let him do nothing? Do we let him walk away? I don't agree with killing him, because we can't do that.
Well, no, nor do I.
But what we can do is make sure these wealthy oligarchs cannot have their money by freezing their asset. The billions
All right,
they've got
fine.
in London.
No, James, I take the point, but I have to say, as soon as he threatened Germany, as soon as he said we're cutting off the oil supply, the gas supply rather, to Germany, I think Mrs. Merkel would change British government policy pretty damn quickly by saying, hey, ease up, guys, or we'll guarantee you no trade deal with Brexit. And after all, she really calls the shots. You're listening to the Nigel Farage Show, exclusive in LBC. It's now 6:45. Well, sterling jumped a bit today on the international exchanges following reports that Britain and Germany are preparing to drop some key Brexit demands to make a deal easier. Now, what we do know is that German companies export a lot of goods to this country, and they are beginning to exert some pressure on Mrs. Merkel and indeed on the European Commission. And so there is talk now, maybe a free trade deal can be done. I'll tell you what's funny. I did a debate with Neil Kinnock in 2001. He said, Nigel, if Britain leaves the European Union, all she would have is a free trade deal. Giscard d'Estaing a few years later said, if Britain leaves this magnificent union, all she will have is a free trade deal. March earlier this year, Donald Tusk, the president of the European Council, said, if Britain wants a free trade deal, we can do one. Why is it, after all these years of saying, if we want a trade deal, we can have one, and we can leave political union, which they see as being a terrible loss to us, but Brexit voters see as being a terrible gain, how is it, on the face of all of this, that Mrs. May has failed to do a simple trade deal? I think it's because she actually wants us to stay closer to the European political project than just having tariff-free access on goods. That is my theory. Back to what she can do about the Russians. Well, why should professional Russian assassins use Russian aliases, asks Ray. Ray, I don't know the answer to that, and that is all a little bit confusing. I don't trust PM May, our government, or our security services, but I trust President Putin, Russia, and their security services even less, says Max from East 18. Thanks, Max. Not sure it takes us anywhere, but thank you for it anyway. Nigel, if Putin thinks it's doing nothing with him, why don't we get him to help us find these men and bring them to justice? Look, the idea that you can actually trust this Russian regime to ever tell the truth or to help us, frankly, is for the birds. And the idea, as I said earlier, of getting them involved in the investigation, all it would do is reveal too many of our secrets. Can't be done. What does Steve in Great Dunmow think? Steve, good evening.
Hi, Nigel. I think what we should do really with Russia is actually befriend them, change our attitude completely towards them, stop interfering in their business, i.e. you take Crimea. In 1850, we had a war with Russia over Crimea. We lost 30,000 soldiers. It was Russia then, it's Russia now. France lost 100,000 soldiers there. We interfere with them, they interfere with us. I've got a solution. Why can't they join the EU?
Don't depress me, Steve. Don't depress me.
No, but seriously, No, but seriously, why can't they join the common market? Wouldn't that be a better thing for everybody? I'm anti-common market, as you know. I want to be out, but honestly, why hasn't Russia ever been allowed to join the common market?
I'll tell you where I will agree with you, Steve. I'll tell you where I will agree with you. Absolutely agree with you. It was, and Cameron was absolutely behind this, it was the European Union's determination to get the Ukraine to join, and the suggestion they could join NATO as well, that was seen by Putin and seen by Russia as a direct threat right up to their borders. It was politically an incredibly stupid thing to do. And I think if you poke the Russian bear with a stick, don't be surprised when you get a reaction. Because, the elected government of the Ukraine was brought down in a coup by people waving European Union flags. So strategically, we've made some big mistakes. But, Steve, we are where we are. The thought of love-bombing Putin right now is not a very likely thing to happen, is it?
No, it's not. But the fact of the matter is, Russia does not want war. They want peace. They want trade, just like everybody else. The West is looking at Russia like it's our number one enemy. It's not. It's not. It's got 140 million people. The population is less than Bangladesh, for Christ's sake. And the fact of the matter is, their economy is smaller than Italy. We know Italy is virtually bankrupt. We just need to befriend them. We need. The main problem we've got is the spread of Muslim Islamic fundamentalism in the world and China. Second,
well, on the issue of Islamist extremism and terrorism, of course, we are very much on the same side as Putin. That strategically would be true. Steve, let me ask you just very quickly. Do you believe that Putin was behind the Salisbury poisonings?
I have no idea. And the fact that we've done stuff far worse ourselves, and we're always involved in it. I mean,
maybe true. Steve, I thank you. I'm going to run lots more callers. Alan in Guildford, new caller to this show. Good evening, Alan.
Good evening, Nigel. How are you?
I am well. So, Alan, put yourself in PM May's shoes. You're in charge. What are you going to do?
Well, look, seriously, I'm a farmer, right?
Okay.
And I'm very, very disappointed in where we are at the moment. I'm quite happy to get out,
Can you just, Alan, talk a little bit more clearly into the mouthpiece, please?
I'm sorry, Nigel.
Yeah, go on.
I'm a farmer, so
yep.
We've heard a lot of things about farmers saying we want to, we're not happy with Brexit and whatever. I have to tell you, I'm happy. I want to get out. I have to grow 3 crops, right? I only have storage enough for 1 crop. It's cost me a lot of money every year.
Alan, we can discuss farming and fisheries and Brexit another time, and I'd love to hear your story and first-hand experience, but let's talk about the Salisbury poisonings. Let's talk about the Metropolitan Police's evidence today and what Mrs May said in the House of Commons. What more can we do?
Internal security is very, very important, obviously, and that's what we're talking about. And,
Okay. Right, Alan, I'm sorry. I'd love to talk to you, but the line is a lot of things going wrong. Breaking news. Ollie Robbins, civil servant, has said the Cabinet did not discuss the plan for a common rulebook on goods with the EU until the Chequers meeting at which the White Paper was agreed. It was the first time the Cabinet had discussed it. Yes, he said. Well, doesn't it just back up every Brexiteer suspicion that Theresa May and the civil service are working to bounce her own cabinet and parliament into and the country into their version of what Brexit is? I'm surprised that only David Davis and Boris Johnson resign. I should have thought a lot more of them should have gone. This is how Mrs May is behaving. I hope those of you out there who constantly say I'm giving her a hard time unnecessarily get the message. She is deceiving us. My last caller tonight on this subject of what Mrs May can do is Martin, and he's calling from Chiswick. Good evening, Martin.
Nigel, the government already made things difficult for Mr Abramovich, stopped him getting back into the country. So he's cancelled his plans for a new stadium, which is just short of £1 billion. Who does that help?
Well, what it does, it hurts construction workers, it hurts architects, it hurts thousands of people who would have been involved in the complete regeneration of Stamford Bridge. That's the truth, isn't it?
Exactly. So freezing the assets of all the Russians is just kicking ourselves in the teeth again.
Martin, it ain't going to happen, and if there was any reaction back against Germany, that would be impossible. Martin, do you agree with me? And tonight I've had people suggesting assassinations, freezing of assets, all sorts. Do you agree with me, Martin? There isn't that much we can really do.
I agree with you entirely. We're a small, comparatively now insignificant country. We're going to be more insignificant when you get your wishes and we leave.
Get out of it. We'll be a global powerhouse. We'll be out. We'll be out here in places like us. Martin, we're out of time. We're out of time. Martin, come back for a Brexit fight anytime you like. You've been listening to the Nigel Farage Show here on LBC. I'm back tomorrow evening at 6 o'clock. At 10 tonight, it's Tom Swarbrick. But up next, it's Ian Dale.